I'm going to show you some classic optical illusions. You've probably seen them before. First, there's this picture of a young woman. See that young woman there? Yep. Did you also see an old woman in there? Here she is. She was there all along. But we have difficulty seeing her. We're so focused on the young woman. And if you go back now, I have a hard time seeing the young woman. Well, here's another one. Here's a picture of a vase. In the background, if you stare at it, you'll see all these black spots flying around. I don't know from the back if you can see that or not.
Yeah, they're there.
Okay, the black spots aren't really there. Isn't that strange? It's called the Hermann grid. But we're fascinated by them, so we pretty much ignore the profile faces that are the biggest part of the picture. It's not a picture of a vase at all. It's a picture of two profiles. It's like the old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. These illusions illustrate why the residents and the rulers of Jerusalem couldn't see that Jesus is the Messiah. Even though the prophecies and the prototypes of the Messiah were read every Sabbath in the synagogue, they couldn't see it. The obvious was obscured by their desires and their assumptions, just like in those illusions. Our text today is the second part of Paul's sermon in Pisidian Antioch to the Jews and God-fearing Gentiles in the synagogue. Let's read it then, Acts 13, 26 to 37. It's a bit long. Brothers, son of Abraham's race, and those among you who fear God, the message of this salvation has been sent to us. For the residents of Jerusalem and their rulers, since they did not recognize him or the voices of the prophets that are read every Sabbath, have fulfilled their words by condemning him. Though they found no grounds for the death penalty, they asked Pilate to have him killed. And when they had fulfilled all that was written about him, they took him down from the tree and put him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and he appeared for many days to those who came with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And we ourselves proclaim to you the good news of the promise that was made to our ancestors. God fulfilled this for us, their children, by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the second Psalm, "You are my son, today I have become your father." Since he raised him from the dead, never to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, "I will grant you the faithful covenant blessings made to David." Therefore he also says in another passage, "You will not allow your Holy One to see decay." For David, after serving his own generation and God's plan, fell asleep, buried with his fathers, and decayed. But the one God raised up did not decay. And we'll stop there. Let's look closely at what Paul is saying here. Verse 26. He calls them brothers. He's not excluding the women. In fact, what I read, there's more women in the synagogue worshiping than there are men. Pretty much like churches, I think. He is identifying with them as the Jewish family. So they're his brothers. I am your brothers, he's saying. What does he mean in the next sentence? The message of salvation has been sent to us. Well, the message is what he's about to explain, but who is the us? He means the message of salvation has been sent to the Jewish family, of which they were all members. This is the Jewish message. The gospel is a Jewish message. It's sent to the Jewish family. What a privilege they've had to carry through the ages the message of God's salvation for all humanity. But something happened. Many Jews did think that Jesus was the Messiah. But then he'd been crucified. That wasn't supposed to happen. And Paul doesn't put the blame on the whole Jewish family. That's the big mistake that historically Christians have made. This isn't the Jews' fault. That's what Paul says. It's specifically the rulers and the residents of Jerusalem's fault. That's who he says it was the fault of. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul all blame the Sanhedrin, were the rulers in Jerusalem, for the death of Jesus. He's just blaming all the Jews. They're the ones that got Jesus crucified, the Sanhedrin. Paul says they had no grounds for execution. Now, that really made me stop. Because it seems to me that Jesus himself deliberately gave the Sanhedrin grounds to get the job done. Move on with this. Well, look at this. It's in Matthew 26:59-66. This is the trial, Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. Then the high priest said to Jesus, "By the living God, I place you under oath. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "Well, you have said it," Jesus told him. "But I tell you, in the future you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What's your decision?" And they answered, "He deserves death." But what had Jesus actually said? And what had they put him under oath to say? What was Jesus quoting? He's reminding them of the prophecies about the coming Messiah. That's who they're talking about here. Daniel 7:13-14. This is where Jesus got this quote. Daniel's saying, "I continued watching in the night visions, and I saw one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given authority to rule and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language would serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed." That's what Jesus was quoting. But you see there, Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah, one like the Son of Man. He's not claiming to be the Ancient of Days. He's not claiming, in this case, to be God. Claiming to be God would be blasphemous and a capital offense. But claiming to be the Messiah was not a capital offense. Jesus' disciples would later come to realize that Jesus was in fact God in the flesh. But Jesus didn't reveal that at this trial before the Sanhedrin. So, Paul's right. The Sanhedrin had no grounds for executing Jesus. That isn't even what they put him under oath for. They had no grounds. Now Paul declares an amazing irony. The great turnabout that God keeps doing throughout the Bible. He seems to love this, flipping things around. The very thing the Sanhedrin was trying to avoid, they brought about by fulfilling the prophecies. Paul says in verse 29, when they had fulfilled all that had been written about him, they took him down from the tree and put him in a tomb. Jesus hadn't fulfilled those prophecies. His enemies fulfilled the prophecies for him. Don't you love it? I love how God does this kind of stuff. We got a problem here, though. There's a little problem. Paul's pretty ambiguous. Who are they? Who's they? He says they, and then he says they, without telling us who they is. Did you ever talk to somebody who never really tells you the people they're talking about? They just use pronouns all the time and you get all lost. Well, that's what Paul's doing. Especially for those of us who know the stories. I mean, the bad guys killed Jesus, but they didn't put Jesus in the tomb, right? So who's the second they? The good guys put Jesus in the tomb. It was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Joseph even donated his family tomb. His wealthy people. So who are they? Well, both the good guys were residents of Jerusalem and rulers. They were part of the synagogue. So Paul has lumped the good and bad guys together. They. He's just being real general about it. Okay, but now Paul has to really answer the big problem. You see, the Messiah was supposed to be this great supernatural hero, the avenger of the Israelites from God, who would conquer Rome, set up a world theocracy that would be run from Israel. That's what the Messiah was supposed to do. Conquer Rome, but Rome killed him. How was that any kind of Messiah? So in spite of all the miracles Jesus is said to have performed, I mean, in Pisidian Antioch, they didn't see him perform these things. They heard about it probably. So in spite of all the miracles he is said to perform, Jesus could not have been powerful at all because Rome couldn't have killed him if he was really the Messiah, right? I mean, there'd been lots of false, don't you love this? Coming sooner or later, the Messiah. There'd been lots of false messiahs. Jesus was just another one, apparently. Even the disciples had thought so in their disappointment after the crucifixion of Jesus. They were all like, well, we thought he was going to be the Messiah, but after all, a dead hero is no hero at all. I mean, a dead hero can't save anyone. Death is kind of permanent, isn't it? So to answer that, Paul, how is a dead and cursed Jesus any kind of Messiah? Surprise! Verse 30. God raised him from the dead. Whoops! Can you imagine the next meeting of the Sanhedrin? I love this too. What? Who says? Now what? You can't even keep a guy dead anymore. Well, let's spread a lie. Let's say his disciples stole the body. Yeah, that's the ticket. That'll do it. And so they spread the lie. That rumor probably had made it to Pisidian Antioch that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus. So Paul has to answer that question. He cites witnesses in verse 31. He says, and he appeared for many days to those who came with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. All right, now remember, you need 3 witnesses in a Jewish court to prove something. And so, how many witnesses do we have here to Jesus' resurrection? You got the women at the tomb. You have the 11 apostles. Judas had already died. You have the other disciples. There are apparently a lot of disciples. You had over 500 brethren, which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:6. 500 brethren who were still alive when Paul was writing. And so certainly we're alive now. Even many of the residents of Jerusalem saw long dead saints walking the streets at the crucifixion of Jesus. They came out of their tombs. Surely Paul's audience had heard about these dramatic events. Surely. Because there's people traveling back and forth all the time. In fact, some of them had probably even been to Jerusalem for that Passover. You read about Matthew 27:51 to 53. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was split in 2 from top to bottom. Well, that would have been a big news right there. The earth quaked. The rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. That must have gotten to Pisidian Antioch by now. So it just takes 3 witnesses to prove something, right? In a Jewish court of law. But here there were many witnesses. Witnesses to the commotion at Jesus' death and also to the resurrection. But Paul, being a very conservative preacher, just sticks to the disciples who had walked with Jesus from Galilee from the beginning of his ministry to Jerusalem where he's put to death. There were many more, but Paul sticks with those. He doesn't even add himself to it because he hadn't walked with Jesus. He had persecuted Jesus' followers. So now Paul refers to himself and to Barnabas in verses 32 to 33. We ourselves proclaim to you the good news of the promise that was made to our ancestors. God has fulfilled this for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the 2nd Psalm, you are my son, today I have become your father. So why is Paul quoting that psalm? Incidentally, there's a difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Bible we look at. In the Hebrew Bible, the 1st Psalm is the introduction to Psalms, and so their 1st Psalm is our 2nd Psalm. So the translators just skip all that and say it's the 2nd Psalm, Psalm 2. What is that psalm that Paul would use it this way? The people of this synagogue had probably been very familiar with this psalm. Most of them had probably memorized it. And so Paul is just quoting one little bit of it to remind them of the whole thing. If I say Mary had a little lamb, the rest of the poem is in your head. Right? Same thing here. He quotes this song. It's sung at the coronation of King David. The psalmist has David saying in Psalm 2:7, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. It's talking about David. It's his coronation. So how can Paul use that to prove anything about Jesus? Well, his audience knew the psalm. And the psalm goes on. It's either hyperbole or he's talking about someone far greater than even King David was or could ever be. Because in Psalm 8, he's at verse 8 of that psalm, he says, ask me, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. The Jews understood that this was indirectly a prophecy of the Messiah, the Son of God. Because David, it didn't fulfill for David, did it? No. But then we have to come to this question. When did Jesus become the Son of God? Lots of debate. But if we understand that Paul is referring to a coronation song, then son here doesn't mean the birth of Jesus. It means when he became king. Because that's what the psalm is about. The resurrection of Jesus was his coronation as Messiah. His birth was announced by a star. His baptism was God's public recognition of his only begotten Son. And the resurrection was the Son's coronation as Messiah. King Jesus, the ruler of heaven and earth. As Jesus declared to his disciples in Matthew 28:18, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Can you imagine somebody saying that? And it being true. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Okay, so Paul is nearing his point now. And he says, since God has raised him from the dead, never to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will grant you the faithful covenant blessings made to David. What was that? He also says in another passage, you will not allow your Holy One to see decay. For David, after serving his own generation in God's plan, fell asleep, was buried with his fathers, and decayed. But the one God raised up did not decay. And that's why the resurrection of Jesus is so important. When I was teaching, I told the kids, Jesus still has a human body in heaven, a glorified human body, but he still looks like he did on earth. You would recognize him if you knew him. Paul recognized him for sure. But they didn't want to see that. They wanted him to be some kind of ethereal spirit. He's a person, a human, glorified. And that's why the resurrection is so important, because it's real. Jesus raised many people from the dead when he was on earth. And even in modern times, people have come back to life. We read about it in the papers, and some of them have written books. And even those that haven't. I mean, there's people have been dead for a while. I mean, every time you're fibrillated, you're brought back from the dead, right? But that's resuscitation. That's not resurrection. People who are resuscitated have to die again. Dang it. I got to do this again. Jesus was not just resuscitated. He was resurrected. Never to die again. And death had no hold on him anymore. His body will never decay. His body was ascended to the right hand of God. He was in his body. So, as the crowned king now, who never dies, as God's Holy One, he is able to grant and fulfill the covenant blessing given to David for his people. David couldn't do it because David died and decayed, and they say his bones were still preserved in Israel. So Jesus now offers his covenant blessings to anyone who wants to enter in to that covenant with him. So what's that covenant? It is the promise of an eternal throne, a kingdom that would never end, a kingdom of peace. So a son of David, Jesus, was granted this covenant, and in his blood he gave a new covenant. His sacrifice instituted a new covenant for us that fulfilled that old Mosaic law, because Jesus rules and has given his blood as an eternal sacrifice. We are no longer condemned by the law of Moses or even by your own conscience. There is now, therefore, no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set us free from the law of death. The law of Moses is no longer applicable. Hebrews 9:15 puts it this way: Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. That's why the resurrection is so important, and why it's so important that it was Jesus as the whole person who was resurrected, not just his spirit. The promise of David's throne was given to Jesus at his birth to begin with. This is the prophecy from Isaiah 9:6-8 that was prophesied for Jesus. For to us a child is born and a son is given. The government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it in justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. And that's where we live now. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. And Paul's saying that's what happened in Jerusalem. He says to the Jews in the synagogue at Pisidian Antioch, the Messiah came to Jerusalem and is now in heaven. Jesus is the resurrected Messiah. All praise King Jesus. All praise Emmanuel.